Hello and welcome back. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. It's been a long time since I've made a lecture video. It's been nice to have some people in class in person, so it's kind of nice to get to almost forget how to do this. We are moving on to the Enlightenment, otherwise known as, well, it's the Age of Reason and then the Enlightenment. Sometimes they're lumped together as the same period. There's kind of division and a division there. In English history, it'd be referred to as the Revolution, the Cromwell Revolution that divides the two time periods. So I will share screen and bring up the PowerPoint. So this is the Restoration and the Enlightenment. Sometimes it's called the Age of Reason. It covers about 100 and almost 150 years, 140 years, 130 years. I guess my math is bad. But early on during the time period, you get a revolution in England called the Cromwellian Revolution, or Cromwell is the general that leads the Revolutionary Army and wins. And then towards the end of the time period, you get the French Revolution. And in between those two, you get the American Revolution. So this is a revolutionary time. There's a lot of turmoil when it comes to royalty. James I, that we ended in the Renaissance, he's technically a Renaissance king, but he's already seen as anti-Calvinist, anti-Puritan. He has a very narrow view of what this new Protestant Christianity in England that they refer to as Anglicanism or the Church of England, what it is. And his view is very narrow. Probably most significant among within his view is something called divine right, and this idea that God chooses who human rulers are, and humans should have nothing to do with it and have no right to change it or interfere with it. And it's a bloodline thing, right? And that ends up being a problem during this time. His son, who became Charles I, was much more tyrannical than James. While James had these views and wrote papers about them and addressed them in public speeches and whatnot, Charles took a lot more action. He was much more active about persecuting the Puritans. Yes, Puritans left England because of James, but Charles was very vocal in public about his persecution of Puritans. And now that Parliament has kind of taken shape as this governing body along with the king, Charles really had problems with that. He was kind of along his dad's line, except on a more exponential level, about divine right. It's like, no, I'm the king. I am the power, not Parliament. And when Parliament would not give him money that he wanted to engage in a war with France, he just shut down Parliament. He closed the doors and sent everybody home. For 11 years. We're not talking like when we shut down Congress for a month or something here, which has happened fairly recently. But he shut it down and kept it closed for 11 years and ran the country by himself. During this time, of course, a revolution starts up. And during the revolution, he ends up getting beheaded by the new rulers of England. So for England to execute its own king just kind of closes the door on this whole idea of divine right. England is proclaiming, no, England chooses the kings, not God. And if we don't like them, we'll get rid of them. Not only does England execute the king, but they execute their archbishop. So this is the head of the church in England. Now, Archbishop Laud, even though he was an Anglican, he was the head of the Church of England. The Pope offered to make him a Catholic bishop, which is, if you think about it, well, now, how are we now a separate church if I'm a Catholic bishop? But he was that old traditional Catholic in his practices. So not only did England execute its king as a result of the revolution, but they executed the head of its church. So this is a huge change in the direction that government will take in England. In the process of all of this, Parliament's going to change, right? It's shut down by Charles, and when Cromwell, who's the general of the Revolutionary Army, when they choose to make him the leader of the country, they don't call him a king. When they choose to make him the leader of the country, Parliament basically runs him. He doesn't run Parliament. So it's a lot more similar to what we have today, even though he was probably, I don't know, I wouldn't call him a dictator. He was military, so it sounds like a military dictatorship, but he followed the rule of Parliament. Parliament splits into two parties, kind of like ours. On one side of the aisle, you have what became called the Roundheads. This was a kind of a derogatory term because of their haircut. Puritans. These are the religious conservatives of the day. Politically, they're kind of liberal in terms of their day because they're anti-monarchy. They're pro kind of like a democracy. Their church was very democratic the way they ran it. But their religious rule was really strict. I mean, they shut all the theaters. There was no gambling allowed. There were really strict rules about how a person could dress. I mean, really strict rules about how people behaved. But they believed in democratic elections, which seems weird, but that's what they were. These are the Roundheads, and they're named that way because of their haircut. On the other side, you have what are known as the Cavaliers. And this is a French name, which comes from the word for horseman, caballero in Spanish, right? And if you think about knights, these are basically knights. That's basically what cavalier means. And it has to do with horsemanship. That was a critical part of knighthood. And they were supporters of a more traditional English government, including monarchy. And because of the combination of the two, you end up with the government you have in England today, where it's pretty democratic, but they still have a monarch. Because you have two parties that figure out, okay, this is how we're going to compromise. We're going to have a king, but the king's power is limited by Parliament. Okay? It's during this revolution that England drafts its Petition of Rights, which is their version of the Bill of Rights. In fact, we copy some of our language from their Petition of Rights and some from the French one that developed during the French Revolution. We use some of their stuff too. Well, or they use some of ours because actually we're first. Puritanism has a significant impact on government through its democracy because they chose their pastors in a democratic way, and the pastors would be the pastor of the church for like a year, and then the church had to vote again, and it might be the same pastor that goes in, it might be somebody else. It's like, and it's actually out of them comes the phrase that becomes part of English government that kings are made by men and may be unmade by the same. This is a direct retort to King James's idea. Well, he didn't invent it, but the one that he subscribed to of divine right, that God chooses king. And the Puritans say, no, man does. The citizens do. And we can unchoose them too. And this is demonstrated by the execution of King Charles and Bishop Laud during the Cromwellian War. You can see the idea that we can unchoose our bishop, just like we can unchoose our pastor. We can unchoose our king because kings should be chosen by men. The Civil War. Sometimes it's referred to as the Scotch Calvin Wars. There's this problem with the northern border of England. I hope you guys have noticed that, dating all the way back to Viking days. Anybody who is rebelling against the government of England runs north and hides on the other side of the war, or of the wall in Scotland, on the other side of all of those castles that Longshanks, right, built, Edward I. And that's where the revolutionaries go. And so when England wants to quelch this revolution, they have to go up to Scotland to fight them. So all these Calvinists that have migrated up to Scotland for their religious freedom That's why it's called the Scotch Calvin Wars. The military leader, his name was Oliver Cromwell. He was a Puritan, and he was the general of the Puritan army. Puritans and Calvinists are like a subset of Puritans. Puritans are a larger conglomerate of, I suppose you could say, more conservative Christians, but more liberal politically. And he was the, frankly, military genius that managed to defeat the English army. It is kind of guerrilla warfare-ish for their day, I guess. A lot more formal than guerrilla warfare is today. And when Cromwell is made the leader, they make England into something they call a Commonwealth Republic. Look at that name and think about what it means. Who does the wealth belong to? Everybody. It's the Commonwealth. So this is kind of a socialist idea. It's really a revolution against feudalist separation that puts these people in these top 1% in control of 90% of the wealth. I'm probably exaggerating, but I'm not by very much. Kind of like what we have seen here in the last, oh gosh, since the 70s or 80s. If you look at the statistics, the shift of wealth in the last 40 years or so to the extremely wealthy has been exponential. And this is part of all of the unrest that we see going on around our country now. It's similar to the Cromwell Revolution, the things that they're upset about. Not so much in the religious terms, but in terms of economy and politics, some very similar reasons. This protectorate, Oliver is the Lord Protector of England. By definition, he's essentially a dictator, but his power is limited by he's a military dictator, right? If you think about what has happened in other countries in revolutions, you have these military dictatorships where the military takes absolute power. Well, that kind of absolute power didn't exactly happen in England because it was subject to Parliament. So it was a kind of a democracy ruled by a military dictator, which seems weird to us. And he's there, he rules for 20 years. The problem is when they get to the end of this 20 years, the English have no clue what to do. They don't want to create another royal line. Is it just going to be Cromwell's son? In fact, Cromwell's son does take over for a very short time after Cromwell dies. And the English start realizing, we just created another monarchy if they're just going to go by family line. If we're going to have a monarchy, why don't we just have a monarchy and bring a king back, but limit the king's power with the Parliament? So that's what they do. They reach out to Charles II, the son of Charles I, who has been raised in exile in France, and invite him to come back to England if he will promise to subject himself to the powers of Parliament. So your power is limited now by Parliament. And Charles says, oh, you want me to come back and live like a king, but not have all the responsibilities? I'm in, right? Who wouldn't be, right? So he comes back, and what's interesting is the things that come back with him. He's been raised in France, which is, we're talking pre-Civil War France, right? Marie Antoinette, before that. So he comes back and he has this opulent taste in art, in clothes, in music, and he brings back a whole plethora of artists with him, and that trickles down, and it has a huge influence on what English art becomes. English art becomes very French because of the restoration of Charles II. And the interesting thing is there is a conflict among the artists now, because you have artists, as you do during any civil war, that strive to be the defining voice of this New England during the Revolution, these revolutionary authors. And then they bring back the king. So you have this, you have two schools of artists that develop during the Age of Reason and Enlightenment. Some romanticize the English royal line and the old tradition of English royalty and of feudalism and all that. And others are elevating the common man. So you have this almost contradiction in English art, and these artists are in debates with each other and get in fights and duels and all that kind of stuff. So as with any revolution, the artists get involved. So here we go. Here are the Cavalier poets. These are the poets that romanticized the English tradition of monarchy. Among them were Ben Jonson, who kind of inherited Shakespeare's shoes. It was funny because during Shakespeare's life, Jonson and Shakespeare were at odds. They wrote horrible things about each other, just criticizing each other. But when Shakespeare died and they released the 1616 quarto, or I'm sorry, the 1623. 1623 is the year Shakespeare died. The 60, am I right? I'm gonna have to look that up. The collection of Shakespeare's plays that was published when Shakespeare died, all of the actors that had performed with Shakespeare and compiled all these plays went to Ben Jonson, who was like the big name playwright in England at the time, and asked if he would write the dedication. So the dedication poem in the cover of that play is written by Ben Jonson, and we will read that later in this unit. Another poet that comes out of this is John Donne. We'll look at one of his essays and maybe some of his poetry. He's a preacher that becomes a poet, but he is a Church of England Anglican preacher, right? He's not a Protestant, well, he's not a Puritan. He's an English Protestant, but he's not a Puritan or a Calvinist. And he writes, well, we're going to get to what he writes here in a minute. It's a bullet that's coming up. Both of these guys actually converted from Catholicism to the Anglican Church as part of their nationalist passion, right? This romanticism of what England used to be before the Revolution. They reformed themselves, right? It was just funny to go to convert to a religion because of political tendencies. The poetry that these poets write is known as metaphysical poetry. And if you look at the term metaphysical, whenever you put the prefix meta at the beginning of the word, you're making the term essentially redundant. So metaphysical means physical nature of physical things. So if I were to say a meta play, it would be a play about a play. Meta writing is writing about writing. Meta reading is reading about how to read. So that's meta. It just turns the term back on itself. So metaphysical is the physical nature of physical things. So they're very scientific, analytical poems. And one of the poems that I hope we get a chance to read in the next few days is a poem by John Donne called Valediction Forbidding Morning. And a passage in that poem compares the relationship of two lovers to the two legs of a draftsman's compass, an architect's compass, which is this two-legged thing with a hinge in the middle and the 2 points on it. And it talks about how the speaker of the poem is talking about his relationship with his lover. And he says that if your foot stays fixed on the point that I'm measuring from with the compass, but I choose to reach out to something else, I'm still connected to you. And so you lean towards me like that second leg of the compass. And when I come back, we both stand up straight and we're like this, we're face to face. It's a really interesting metaphor for a relationship. It's like, yes, we are face to face. We are meeting as equals. And if I go somewhere else, you lean to support me in that reach. And if you go somewhere else, I keep my foot fixed and I lean to adjust to the direction you're going. Which is a beautiful metaphor for a relationship. But who would use a compass as a romantic metaphor? It's not a flower. It's not a piece of fruit. It's not, I mean, think about all the metaphors that poets have used to describe their love. It's never a machine. This is essentially a small machine. So that's an example of metaphysical poetry. It's kind of mathematical poetry-ish. Yeah. And there are followers to these poets, and hopefully we'll get a chance to look at those. Time's running out this year, so we'll see. Robert Herrick, I can't remember Suckling's first name, and Richard Lovelace. Great names for poets, all of them. But they're followers of Ben Jonson, who was like the leader of the Cavalier Poets. Okay, so now we're going to go to the other side of the aisle. Oh, on the school of Donne. These are the sons of Donne. I forgot the followers of Donne are Herbert and Marvell. Let's look at some of their poetry too. On the other side of the aisle, you have the Puritan writers. And these guys are going to be very religious, but their ideas are kind of politically liberal. So you have Milton, John Milton, who writes Paradise Lost, probably the greatest epic poem of the English language. Do I dare say that? I think so. People talk about the great English authors. They're Chaucer, Milton, and Shakespeare. That's it, right? They're the big three. And Milton sees, there's all these great epic poems. People are writing epic poetry historically. People aren't doing it much more during his day. And he sees that people revere people like Homer and Virgil and these guys that wrote the great Greek and Roman epics. We need a good English epic. And their epics were driven by their religion. Our epic should be driven by ours. So he writes an epic poem about Satan's fall from heaven, or he would say man's fall from the grace of God, right? And so the main character in the play is Satan. The interesting thing about this is many of modern Christianity's views about who Satan is or how Satan works don't come from the Bible. They come from Milton. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, and by the way, Milton's Lucifer, Milton's Satan is probably the greatest tragic hero of the English language, with Hamlet being a close second. But Lucifer is probably the greatest tragic hero of English literature. Also, and his work is super freaking brainiac, dense, heavy. You have to know your history because of all the people in hell. You have to know what the hell he's talking about. But you also have to know your Bible to understand who he's talking about. So it's written only for literate people. It's very exclusive. On the flip side, within the Puritan school, you have John Bunyan, both John Milton, John Bunyan. And Bunyan's greatest work, Pilgrim's Progress, is super simple to read. Probably the earliest, really the earliest book for every man in England. My dad, I was raised in the mission field by conservative Christians, and my dad required all five of his kids, all five of us, to read Pilgrim's Progress. I think it was like about at the age of 12 he gave it to us. The book freaking scared the hell out of me because Satan's in it and he's really a scary figure. But it's allegorical. And if you don't know what an allegory is, I would encourage you to look that term up. Pause here and look it up. Essentially, the names of the characters are very literally meaning something else. The main character's name is Christian. He has a friend named Faithful. He goes through a place called the Slough of Despond. He carries a burden on his back that literally falls off of his shoulders when he reaches the foot of the cross. I mean, it's everything in it is a really obvious metaphor. So even the lowest level of education, as long as they could read, or if somebody read it to them, if they couldn't read, they could understand it. They got it, and they got the point. It was really accessible. These are both kind of biblical in nature. They use what we think of as biblical, the thee, thou, which is basically just familiar voice in English that we've done away with. In Spanish, it's the tú form, right? Which you only use among your closest friends. And we've done away, even in Spanish, we've done away with the plural version of it, vosotros. I don't know if there's a plural version. Thine? I don't know. I don't know if there's a plural version in English. Thee and thou is the English informal, the familiar. Which is funny because we think of it as formal. It's actually familiar. It's the opposite of formal. They're both allegorical. Bunyan is for the simple-minded, the lower education. Most people didn't get more than 1 or 2 years of education if they got any. The politics in a lot of the Puritan writers was approached as a moral issue more than a social issue. And this is why you have those really strict rules about how you dress and the things you can and can't do in Puritan government. And this brings up the etymological definitions of liberal and conservative, which are probably really important things for us to discuss today. Because at the literal meaning of the word, liberal means freedom. It comes from liberty. It's the same root as freedom. Liberal means you are free, right? You choose things that give you more freedom. And conservative means you confine yourself to the tried and true, right? So this has worked for the last 100 years. We shouldn't change it. That's conservative. Liberal means we should be open to trying a new way of doing it. So if you look at the actual definition of words, which is kind of funny because if you look at politics today, some policies that are referred to as liberal actually limit some people's rights, and some policies that are actually called conservative actually expand some people's rights. So we've kind of messed with these definitions in modern politics. So some of the ideas that earned the title Enlightenment for this time period. One I've already referenced, the evolution of Satan. When we were doing Chaucer and I showed you, we talked about the merchant in Chaucer and how the forked beard and the Flemish beaver hat and the motley clothes made him look like what they thought the devil looked like. And I believe I showed you a picture from Milton's Paradise Lost in which the devil looked like he was dressed like a Roman soldier because England during this time, during Milton's time, villainized the Catholic Church. So they made Satan look like a Roman, thinking that that's what Catholics looked like. That doesn't make much sense, but that's what they did. And I want you to keep in mind what Satan might become, okay? So I bring this up again because we're now in the time of Milton, that other image that I showed you. Copernican theory, this is when the scientific revolution happens. That's part of why it's called the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. This is the scientific revolution. So Copernican theory, it wasn't invented during this time. Copernicus was much older than this, or much earlier than this. But during the Enlightenment, a much higher percentage of scientists embraced Copernican theory, which said that the sun was the center of the universe, and we were just a little pebble that are spinning around it. Pre-Copernican theory, and actually the Catholic Church did not embrace this theory until the late 1800s. Pre-Copernican theory argued that Earth was the center of the universe and everything else went around us. This is why Aristotle says that tragedy should happen in a single rotation of the sun, because they thought the sun went around us, the other way around. But Copernican theory is more widely embraced by scientists during this time. That makes humans, in the scope of things, smaller, right? We're just a little pebble spinning around the sun, and we're tiny, tiny, not invisibly tiny specks on that pebble. So it creates this significant distance between God and man, which you could argue is one of the results of widely embraced humanism from the Renaissance. You have the Royal Society that is set up during this time, which was basically it was an endowment for the arts run by the government. So the government dumps a whole bunch of money into this thing, and artists could apply for grants to pursue their artistic endeavors. It's like we go find a great painter and we pay them to paint all year long, produce as much art as they can, or whatever, or musicians to compose, or whatever the art form is. So the Royal Society was England's first official government-run art endowment fund, basically, or science endowment fund. You get an art endowment fund later. This is the science endowment. Theories from Darwin about survival of the fittest begin to be applied to economics, which is where we get capitalism from, right? Survival of the fittest. It's like, let people get in there and duke it out. And if they're good, they'll survive. If not, the business will die. Some of the puritanical policies that come out of this Enlightenment after the Revolution, that 20 years that Cromwell is Lord Protector, there's no gambling allowed. There's no horse racing because it's associated with gambling. They restrict newspapers. They start shutting down newspapers. They get rid of all the flashy clothes. It's like your clothes had to be brown, black, or white, I think were the options. There's no public dancing. Theaters get closed. It's really kind of a starvation mode for a lot of the arts. So now we're going to get into some royalty. James I was the first of the Stuart line. Now, there's two ways to spell Stuart. When it was in Scotland, it was Stewert. When they became English, it changed to this spelling. So in England, it was this. So James was a Stuart. Technically, he's a Renaissance king, right? Because that's where we ended last time. He taught divine right. He's the guy that put together the commission for the King James Bible. Remember, we talked about that was a political decision because he had to make sure there weren't so many upstarts and debates and conflicts, religious conflicts. He continues to invest in the arts like Elizabeth, his predecessor, did. And he married Margaret Tudor. So like a niece or something like that in the Tudor line, which consolidated his claim to the throne. His son, Charles I, which we already talked about before the Revolution, more actively pursues the Calvinists and Puritans, and he's executed during the Cromwell Revolution after having shut down Parliament for 11 years. Remember that piece too, right? That's a big deal to shut down Parliament. And then royal line is interrupted, right? Because Cromwell and the Revolution execute Charles I and Archbishop Laud. And then for a little bit, like a couple of years or something, his son is like in charge, the royal protector, who really is subject to Parliament. After the Restoration, when they choose to bring back a king because they realize, oh, we just created another monarchy, they bring back Charles. And what's funny is the Restoration was this huge celebration. It's like all of England was holding its breath, especially once Cromwell started getting old. It's like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? We're going to have another revolution? What are we going to do? It's like they couldn't imagine something besides a monarchy, except to bring back a monarch and make sure his power is limited by Parliament. So they bring back Charles II, and there's this huge celebration. Everybody's dancing in the streets. There's bonfires in the streets. They're happy. Everybody is just having a great time, and like they can breathe finally. There's this nationwide sigh of relief. He's restored to the throne in 1660. The interesting thing is, in private, this guy's Catholic, and he's the King of England. And if you remember, by law, the King of England is the head of the English church. This is a problem. But since his power is limited by Parliament, and he concedes to that, it's like, okay, I'll let you guys call the shots. I'm just kind of here for the pomp and circumstance. It works for Charles. His son, however, Charles II, also Catholic, but he couldn't keep it to himself. Charles kept his Catholicism in the closet. James didn't. He was out. And he was very stubborn. And like Grandpa Charles the First, or is that right? Yeah, it goes James, Charles, James, right? James the First, Charles the First, Charles the Second, James the Second. It's a James and Charles sandwich. Okay. So he's Catholic, and he's out as a Catholic, and he's stubborn, and he gets sick and tired of trying to answer to Parliament, and so he shuts down Parliament. And not too long after he shuts down Parliament, he just exiles himself. He says, I'm getting the hell out of Dodge because I saw what happened to my grandpa. They chopped off his head. So he goes to France. And you wonder why England couldn't breathe? Because they were afraid of this happening. Charles's heir, the person that followed, or James's heir, was his daughter, Mary, who was married to a man by the name of William of Orange. You've probably heard there's a William of Orange College, I think, in the US. When they put William and Mary on the throne, it's the English call it the Glorious or the Bloodless Revolution, because they make sure it's written into the documents exactly what the limitations are, excuse me, that Parliament imposes on the monarchy. And probably most importantly, they write the law that says only a person who is already a Protestant can sit on the English throne. No more Catholic kings in England. That's a law. You can't have a Catholic king in England or queen. This revolution takes place in 1688. So just 28 years after the restoration of Charles II, you have another revolution-ish. They call it a bloodless or glorious revolution because it was just policy change. And graciously, James left the country voluntarily, so they didn't have to shed his blood anyway. After William and Mary, who had no children, no heir, I don't remember if they had no children or if their children were Catholic. That could have been it too. But the next heir is Queen Anne. And if you've been to Seattle, you've heard about Queen Anne. It's one of the hills. It's also an architectural style. It's also kind of lace. It's a clothing style. There's a bunch of stuff named after Queen Anne. And under her rule, probably most significantly, is drafted the Act of Union, which makes England, Ireland, Scotland, and technically Wales, and all one country. And it's at this point that one of the things incorporated into the coat of arms for England is 3 crowns. And there's some debate about that because Wales should be a 4th crown. And then there's all kinds of upstart about that. But anyway, England, Ireland, and Scotland. Anne never has an heir. So you end up with another problem. So they go to the most distant relative, who happens to be a German prince. Now we go to the Hanover line. So we've gone from the Tudors to the Stuarts to the Hanovers. And the Hanovers were German. And there were a lot of people who were not too hip to the idea of a German being king, and including George I, the guy that became king. He wasn't too excited about being king of England. He didn't speak English, and he didn't want to learn. But it's like, okay, kind of like Charles II. Okay, you want to give me the pomp and circumstance and not the real responsibility because you guys have this thing called Parliament? Cool. You guys rule, and I'll be your puppet. You just tell me what to do. In fact, he lived in Germany much of his rule. He didn't want to live in England. He'd come over to England when they needed him for something, you know. Probably the most significant thing that George I did was he asked Parliament to choose a prime minister. It's like, okay, if you guys are going to run things, you should have somebody who's like the main voice that talks to me, and then I'll declare it law, right? And that becomes Robert Walpole, who's the first prime minister of England, and a very good one. He was remarkable, a remarkable politician. Throughout George I's rule, there are ongoing wars with France, probably thanks to Charles II, the guy that shut down Parliament so he could start a war with France. But England and France have been at odds almost forever. George is succeeded by his son, also George, convenient, George II. And George II is the last English king to this date that was born outside of England. He was born in Germany because Dad preferred to live in Germany. He starts a war with Spain against the prime minister's advice. He's constantly at odds with Robert Walpole, with the prime minister. It's like these stupid English kings can't learn that you can't go against Parliament, especially now that it's written into law, right? And this conflict also was something that he had with his own dad. There was a conflict there too. It's like he didn't agree with his dad giving in to Parliament. Says, you're the king, step up, run that place, right? George I was like, well, no, this is the English way. This is how the English do it. I'm representing them, not representing me. Well, George II says, no, it's my country, right? And that conflict that he had with his dad also continued with his son. It's like he was the outlier of the Georges. George II was the one that was the problem. Because that continued on with his son, who would eventually become George III. So you got 3 Georges here. To give you an idea of the kind of person George II was, when his wife died, she encouraged him to find another wife. And he responded, and it's written in French here, I can't pronounce it correctly, non j'aurai de maîtresse. No, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to have mistresses, right? What a nice thing to tell your wife on her deathbed, right? Jeez. So he's kind of a jerk. George II is kind of a jerk. George III is the first English king who is, one, born in England, and who spoke English as his primary language, as his native language. Think about that. Every king before this is taught to speak French, except for the Georges who spoke German, right? It wasn't until George III that he was raised in England speaking English. He had a reputation for being strong-headed, but at least he negotiated with his prime ministers. This is the king that was king during the American Revolution and the king who was blamed for the American Revolution by letting America have too much autonomy. That's why we're here, guys. And when England tried to push him to control the Americas more, they lost Americas. He did struggle with Parliament because Parliament, I have to check. I don't remember if there was a Cavalier majority or a Roundhead majority in Parliament. I'd have to do my research to find that out. It might be later in the slideshow. But he conflicted. His ideals conflicted with parliament, I think they were more conservative, more monarchy based, more cavalier. The interesting thing about George, and this, England didn't know how to deal with him. This is a king who actually openly loved his wife. He didn't have a whole mess of mistresses. He was demonstrative of his affection for his wife in public, which is not a very English thing to do. They're pretty reserved, right? But I mean, forever, English kings had had mistresses that they were actually in love with, and their wives were a convenience or political thing, right? So he's pretty monogamous. He would actually spend much of his free time when he had it with his family. Many of the portraits of George III, it's like he's got little kids crawling on him and his dog is laying on his lap and he's like a family guy. And the English didn't know what to do with this. He didn't act like a king. And he wore what they considered to be business clothes at the day. He didn't dress with the French opulence of a Charles or a James. So they didn't really know what to do. He did have issues towards the end of his life with mental health, and was locked up as insane. They kept him in the tower. The problem in England is if you're king, you are king for life, no matter what your mental state is. And they thought that he had become incapable of ruling. He may have. More recent autopsies have suggested there was some porphyria, which people call vampirism, which is not a real accurate description. It just means it's something that causes anemia. So you need like blood transfusions, right? Some people think it was caused by arsenic, which might have, I don't think it was because of anybody was trying to kill him. There was a practice among royalty of trying to develop immunity to potential poisons. So, or it could have been like lead leaching into his food because a lot of the dishes that they used or the crystal that they put their alcoholic beverages in had lead in them, which is interesting because today when we think about it, we very rarely store alcoholic beverages in crystal containers, which was a tradition for hundreds of years. And true leaded crystal, that stuff that rings when you tap it with your fingernail, true leaded crystal has lead in it. That's why it's called leaded crystal. And they would put their port or their brandy or whatever it was that they drank in these expensive carved or ornate leaded crystal containers, and the lead would leach into the beverage. And so lead poisoning was a problem, and that could have been something related to it. I don't know. But he had some mental issues, and he ended up getting locked up for the last several years of his rule, which means somebody else is going to be in charge. Thank God there's Parliament. Somebody can still run the country, right? And that's the end of royalty for the Age of Reason. And I will start a new video here because this one's getting long enough.
What are you doing? Are you insane?
I forgot I put sound effects in there. Bye.